الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين اللهم افتح على أسماعنا وأبصارنا وأفئدتنا وأرواحنا فتحا يليق بجودك وكرمك يا أرحم الراحمين وبعد Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to the second lecture of Ramadan in prep. Last lecture, a week ago, we spoke about the essence of fasting. What does it mean to fast? And we spoke how fasting is a vehicle like other worshipping activities to achieve the taqwa from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then we define taqwa as the effortless inclination of the nafs to do what is good, what is pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and to avoid everything that is displeasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That spontaneous inclination. And when you achieve that, then you achieve the taqwa. And then we spoke about the different levels of fasting. صوم العوام, صوم العامة, the general public fasting, and then the special, and then the elite. Today, I thought I'm gonna give you some unconventional topic, inshallah, and speak about what happens when you fast, and why fasting is essential in achieving the taqwa, and how does that happen? How does that occur in your brain? And we're gonna call this lecture the chemistry of taqwa. How does taqwa happen? Or if you want to take a light title, the chemistry of fasting. So we're gonna just move you to a different level of science, inshallah, so we can understand what happens to the human being and why we do what we do. So, we all know that the humans are a species of habits, right? Just like other species, we have routine habits. And humans are not different. They have the same routine, the same habits, the same structure of the day. And I will give you an example. In a regular day, you're working, you're studying, you're just going with your regular day, and you look at the clock or at your watch, and it's close to 12. What happens? Lunchtime, right? So you go and you sit in the cafeteria or the kitchen or whatever, and then what happens after that? You start eating and you do what? You turn your phone on, right? You check your Instagram, your Facebook, your YouTube, and you just keep going back and forth in cycles, right? This is very habitual. So that is very regular, routine behavior of many people, right? But why does that happen? I mean, why don't you get hungry like at 1 o'clock or at 11 o'clock, right? Because you're habituated to do that. You have learned that behavior, that at noon I am going to what? To feel hungry. And if you delay it, you'll suffer, right? But what happens if you say, you know what, I'm gonna move my lunchtime from noon to 1 o'clock. What happens? Few days and you suffer. But after that, you learn a new behavior, correct? So, at a different level, certain people also are habituated to eat certain types of food. One person would like to have chocolate, right? One person would like to have candies. To a different level, you have people who exercise, and you get people who get runner's high, right? So there are bad behaviors, there are good behaviors, but all of these things, the bottom line, are what? Learned behaviors, right? We're not created just to do that. We're created, there are certain aspects of our life, feeling hungry, feeling thirsty, feeling fearful. These are essential to our creation. We are designed to do so. But everything else, the routine things on our daily basis that happen are what? Learned behaviors, right? So far so good? Easy and simple. So let's move to some more details now, inshallah. Everyone knows the experiment of the dog and the bill, the Pavlovian response. So, what happened, can you click it from there? Just advance it one slide, please. Okay. So what happened, Pavlov, the Russian scientist, noticed that when you introduce the food to the dog, what does the dog do? It salivates, right? So this is a natural, normal response. And then he noticed that when the person enters the room where the dog is, once the dog hears the footsteps of that person, they salivate. Once they see the food itself, they salivate. Right? And what he did, said, okay, there is something to this. So he brought a tuning fork, and each time the food is introduced to the dog, what happens? He rings the bell or the tuning fork, he strikes it in this condition, and it produces noise, the ringing noise, and the dog salivates. And later on, when he withdrew the food, he would just strike the tuning fork, and the dog would what? Salivate. Why is that? This is what we call conditioned behavior. The dog has acquired a new reflex that is called conditioned reflex, where any stimulus, anything that provokes a response, in this case the salivation, then he would what? Respond by that response, the salivation. So even when the food is not introduced, the dog would salivate just to the noise, the ringing noise of the tuning fork, right? And the more association between the food and the ringing, the more salivation and the longer the response would last, right? Even if you withdraw the food, the salivation would continue with each time there is ringing of that tuning fork. So this is what we call, when we pair the stimulus, the stimuli, there is a condition which is the learned behavior that the dog acquires. Okay? And in order to get rid of this learned behavior, you withdraw the food and you keep the tuning fork. The first time the dog would salivate, second time would salivate, but after 10, 15 times it will start salivating less and less and less till the response fades away. So this is what we call learned behavior. And most of what we do on a daily basis has nothing to do with our judgment, with our decisions. It's just learned behavior. It's at 12 o'clock, I have to feel hungry. I sit at the chair at the table, then the phone has to be on. When the phone is on, then YouTube has to be on, and I have to listen to music, and I have to listen to this, and it's endless series of conditioned behaviors. Is that clear? So we talked about that humans are a species of habits. We've talked about that most of what we do is acquired, learned behavior based on conditioning. Okay? But how does that happen at the level of the brain? Next slide, please. So, they've noticed that there is one important part of the brain, that's the nucleus accumbens. You don't have to remember that. We're not going to quiz you on that, I promise. And an area called ventral tegmental area, VTA. So each time there is something pleasurable, the brain produces certain chemical. What is that chemical? Dopamine. Okay? Each time there is a reward, basically, there's dopamine. You eat a chocolate, dopamine is up. Someone smokes a cigarette, dopamine is up. Intimacy, dopamine is up. Right? And each time there is any sort of the pleasure, reward, there is dopamine. Who can give me some practical examples that is very dependent on dopamine production in the brain? It's very practical, in the hands of everyone. That's your Facebook, the like. What happens each time there is a like? There is a dopamine. When you tell a person, good job, what do they feel? The pride. Why does that happen? Dopamine. And what happens when they have that? Dopamine begets, or reward begets, the seeking of more reward. So you have a reward, there is dopamine. Dopamine wants more dopamine, right? You got a like, you need another like. So this is exactly, they know the psychology of the human being, and this is how they came up with these features, right? So the dopamine is responsible for that pleasure/reward response, right? And that response would want you to do more, seeking more responses, more dopamine. And this is what we call the dopamine loop. It's seeking the pleasure, seeking the reward. Okay? You eat, there is dopamine, and you want to eat more, and it's never enough. And this is what happens to addicts, by the way. Right? There is dopamine, but after a while, there is so much response or so much pleasure you can feel, and the dopamine loop stops working. So there is bankruptcy, what they call it. So there is not much response. So how do you reverse that process? What did Pavlov do to the dog? You remove the secondary stimulus, and it fades away with time, right? In order to get rid of the dopamine, what happens? Or what do? We abstain from anything that produces that dopamine. Is that clear? Yeah. So this is what they call now, we have a lot of Gen Zs and millennials here. What is the new cult that people live now? Kind of fasting? Dopamine fasting, right? I mean, people in the Silicon Valley and in the tech arena, they know what dopamine fasting. Meaning you have to abstain from all the activities, specifically, your stimulations by media, by technology, to stop that dopamine cycle, and this way you would regain the pleasure. When you abstain from it and you introduce it again, you enjoy it more because now the dopamine comes back fresh, right? So, as a human beings, most of what we do is dependent on what? On dopamine. We're slaves to dopamine loop, basically. We want to do anything that produces dopamine. That is the pleasure, that is the joy, the temporary, transient pleasure and joy that we live. Is that clear? So, that applies to fasting, to eating, drinking, intimacy, many of the activities that we do, right? So how does that apply to fasting? What does fasting do? First, it comes and breaks your schedule. It forces you to go through that boot camp at a communal level where it's easier for people to do it. Where, number one, you are not conditioned to a certain time. You cannot eat breakfast at 8 o'clock now. You cannot eat lunch at noon. You cannot eat dinner between 5 and 6. How are you going to do that? You're going to eat and drink on Allah's schedule now. And is that schedule fixed? No. Because every year is different from the previous year. Why is that? Because it's a lunar calendar. So Allah makes you fast every single day of the year throughout your life. And every year is different from before. So noontime comes, there is no dopamine anymore. So the first time you suffer, second time you suffer, after 3 days, the brain is, you're telling your brain, no matter what you do, you're not going to get that piece of meat. Okay? No matter how hard you strike that tuning fork, there is not going to be food introduced with it, so the salivation stops, meaning the hunger response stops. Right? So that is the concept of fasting. What else is happening? Intimacy is forbidden. Right? It's limited to certain times, as we recited in the ayahs, and there is no dopamine otherwise associated with that. So Allah is breaking for you all these circuits, all these dopamine loops, in order to restore your what? Purity. So our purity is disrupted by what? By our dependence on the dopamine. We're becoming the slaves to dopamine, and the fasting is nothing but liberating you from that dopamine circuit and making you fast, abstain, just like people do the dopamine fasting now, at a physical level. Right? What else happens during Ramadan? So the first one, it breaks the schedule, the time conditioning, basically. Right? Physiologically, you're put in a different state of eating. We don't want to go into too much details of the physiology, but you start eating less and less. So your attachment to certain foods, well, naturally, people would eat less and less, right? Some people would prove you wrong. They make a point to prove you wrong. So, but naturally, you should be eating less and less, and that's your attachment to certain foods, right? So there's so much you can eat, at one meal, in the middle of the night, or at the breakfast, and that's by itself would detach you from a lot of what you eat on a normal basis. From the snacks that you eat, you go into the pantry back and forth, one time for a cookie and another for chocolate. So that dopamine spikes intermittently during the day is completely eliminated. Okay? What happens on the other hand? So here you can see the blue and you can see the red circle. So the dopamine is the pleasure, the reward cycle, what makes you addicted to food, what makes you addicted to certain behaviors that on a regular basis during the day. But there's also the serotonin, which is the happiness neurotransmitter or chemical. Serotonin, it's what makes you feel the tranquility on a regular basis. It's the long-term well-being, stability, tranquility. Okay? So we have the dopamine, that is the temporary pleasure reward. That's a like on Facebook. That's the piece of chocolate, this and that, okay? Makes you feel temporarily joyous. Have that temporary pleasure. But some people are always calm, have the tranquility. What does that mean? They have adequate serotonin, right? Now, how is serotonin is peaked in the blood or maintains adequate levels in the brain? If you haven't SSRIs, a pill, right? We need to fix everything with a pill. We want to do it natural. So if you haven't read my article, Chemistry of Happiness, please do. Just search it on Google, Chemistry of Happiness, Bassem Hamid, it will come up. You will learn, inshallah, a lot of useful things. And it talks in details about this concept, by the way. But what we've learned from research that there are so many things that would contribute to the elevation of serotonin in your brain, right? Without taking a pill. Some of that is the physical activity. Is there physical activity in Ramadan? There's Taraweeh. And we talked about before that the Sahaba, you know, when Umar radiallahu anhu assigned Ubay the Taraweeh, you know how much they would sit in the Taraweeh? They would hold a stick in order to lean on it. And by the time they're finished, everyone is barely able to walk, dragging themselves. So they would read between 20 to 30 ayahs. It was levels, 20, 25, 30 ayahs in each rak'ah. Meaning Surah Tabarak is 30 ayahs. That's how many pages? 1, 2, 3 and a quarter. So 3 pages approximately in one rak'ah. So every 10 days almost they're completing one khatam of the Quran. Imagine doing that. That's a lot of serotonin, my friend. Right? We're doing the brief version, obviously, you know. Hence, we're not having the serotonin spike much. So that's number one, physical activity. Right? Even if you're taking all SSRIs of the world, if you're not physically active, it's not going to work. You have to generate it organically, internally. This is how it works. Number 2, and apologies I don't have that slide. Inshallah, I'll bring it next time for you. They've done research and showed that there are certain areas in the brain would light up and would show actually spikes of serotonin. After what? After having, and listen to what I'm saying, rhythmic, repetitive supplications. They were not studying Muslims. They were just studying what singing, what chanting would do if you do it repetitively in a certain rhythm, in a certain melody. And what is that? It is your recitation of the Quran on your own or listening to it in the Taraweeh. And this is something that would result absolutely in a huge spike of serotonin. That's why when they took the blood of fasting people, they saw elevation of the serotonin. Is it related to these activities or to some other activities? Allahu A'lam. But all in all, there is increased serotonin. Clear? So, the salah itself, the meditation, by being silent, by being detached from the world, the meditation itself produces serotonin. This is when you sit and you do your adhkar. This is when you sit and you pray in khushu'. This is exactly what Allah puts you during that month. Ramadan is not only about fasting, it's all these rituals that we do in Ramadan. It is reciting the Quran on a daily basis, praying up in Taraweeh, and what else we do? What's the other activity that we do during Ramadan? Giving, right? And that by itself increases serotonin. So we have on one hand suppression of dopamine, and on the other hand enhancement of what? Serotonin. And that is exactly what gets you in that state of well-being. And this is, subhanAllah, as Ramadan progresses day after day, you start feeling that tranquility. You start feeling that calm. And if you're not, then there is something wrong. It has to happen, right? And after Ramadan, how long does that last? So long you keep the practices. So you gain that momentum, and your job now, you went through a lot of vigorous training, lot of exercise. So your job is to do what? Is to keep it, to maintain it, right? Otherwise, your serotonin is going to go down, and you're going to go back to what? Dopamine slavery, to all these habits. This is why the Prophet ﷺ recommended, okay, we're going to keep fasting. We're going to keep fasting at least 3 days a month. You have the 6 days of Shawwal, you have the Mondays and Thursdays. We were reading before the Saturdays, Sundays, Mondays, and then the Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. This is the practice of the Prophet ﷺ. In order what? To maintain that balance, that chemical balance, right? When someone is depressed or they have a problem, they say, well, they have chemical imbalance, right? So Ramadan actually is one of the most important ways of restoring that balance. And it has shown, fasting has been proven to help with mental illnesses, with anxiety, with depression, with a lot of other mental illnesses. How? By restoring that balance between the different neurotransmitters, chemicals, specifically the dopamine and what? The serotonin. So back to summarize, we talk about how we are species of habits. Most of what we do, just like the dog learns how to salivate in response to the ringing, we have a lot of acquired, learned behaviors that are we're not hardwired originally to it. And that is because of the reward pleasure chemical that is the dopamine, right? And by fasting, you reset that dopamine circuit. And on the other hand, you enhance and increase the serotonin, which is the well-being neurotransmitter or chemical. And by doing the fasting, you're restoring that chemical balance between dopamine and serotonin and becoming a happier person, right? And this is basically the essence of taqwa. The taqwa basically keeps you away from all the dopamine responses, and it brings you more towards more serotonin, right? So now we understand why I called it the chemistry of taqwa. There is truly some underlying physiologic, real chemical changes that happen, which is the underpinning of the spiritual experience that we live. During the salah, during fasting, during the dua. Dua is one of the things that we neglected to talk about, but that also would bring your serotonin higher, with the emotions, with the feelings mixed with it. All that stuff would do what? That balance, subhanAllah. And this is why, wallahi, one of the greatest ni'mah, the greatest gifts of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to His people is what? Is the ni'mah of Saum. Why? It's all about benefiting you. It's all about making you a more balanced person, a happier person, that is not enslaved by certain habits, which would ruin you, which would destroy your well-being. We're not talking about other health benefits of Saum. I'm only talking about the spiritual aspects and about the chemical aspects at the mental level. We haven't talked about, the impact of Saum on diabetes and on your lipid profile and all that. All that has been proven to be positive, but our focus today is to understand how we become better human beings and how our well-being is enhanced by fasting. I'm going to stop here, inshallah. We'll cut it short for you today. And if you have any questions, please go ahead. Or if you need me to explain certain aspects, I'm happy to. I try to simplify it as much as possible, but there's certain things you cannot make more simple.
Now, we said that the research said that chanting a melodious rhythmic way would increase serotonin. Is the same thing with listening to it as well?
Yes. Listening to it. Either saying it or listening to it. Yeah. This has been done on Muslims, by the way. There is research where they did functional MRIs on Muslims, and same results happened.
Is it possible to have both dopamine and serotonin to be high, or it has to be either one or the other?
Well, there are positive dopamine increase. That is the physical activity. That's when you run. It's a positive thing. But we're talking about the negative aspects, that addiction to food, addiction to drugs, addiction to certain habits, right? But normally what you would have, the serotonin and occasional spikes of dopamine by healthy habits. We're talking about the negative spikes of dopamine that's brought by unhealthy habits, which would lead to dopamine bankruptcy eventually. And abstaining, the more you abstain from these habits, the more you will enjoy it. Okay? If you're on your phone at 7 hours a day, it becomes, you're not finding the pleasure much. But if you do it half hour or 10 minutes, it's more enjoyable actually, because there is more dopamine associated with that. And that's where the concept of dopamine fasting comes. We're abstaining from it, and when you're introduced to it again, it's more pleasurable. Any other questions? اللهم اقسم لنا من خشيتك ما تحول به بيننا وبين معاصيك ومن طاعتك ما تبلغنا به جنتك ومن اليقين والرضا ما تهون به علينا مصائب الدنيا. متعنا اللهم بأسماعنا وأبصارنا وقوتنا ما أحييتنا، واجعله الوارث منا، واجعل ثأرنا عمن ظلمنا، وانصرنا على من عادانا. اللهم اغفر ذنوبنا واستر عيوبنا واقض حوائجنا وتقبل أعمالنا. وصل اللهم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله والحمد لله رب العالمين. We'll see you next Wednesday بإذن الله تعالى.